Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all who've joined, and welcome to the second Global Flourishing Conference hosted by the Templeton World Charity Foundation. My name is Ridi Klabi. I am a journalist, a producer, author, presenting radio and television. I'm very honored to serve as MC for this conference. I did so last year, same role, same opportunity, and it was very invigorating to be part of the convening of the Global Flourishing Conference. And I'm looking forward to see how this important area of research and innovation has continued to grow, to evolve, and to change lives. So this is what's going to happen. Over the next 2 days, we will hear from leading experts in flourishing. We have an exciting lineup of speakers, world experts, presenters across critical topics like science of loneliness and how to foster social connectedness, planetary flourishing. And I'm thinking here we've got COP28 coming in a couple of days, so very relevant and the right time as well. We're going to hear about religions as a source of individual and communal flourishing and more. So a full package for you. But before we get going, let me take a few moments to just point out for you key features on this virtual conference platform. How to navigate between sessions. Right now, we are in the first session on day one under the program agenda. So to move between sessions, click on back to timeline, and then enter each session as they begin, okay? The second thing I want to share with you, exploring the scientific abstract poster hall. If you want to explore the scientific abstract poster hall, this is how you do it. The global call for abstracts this year resulted in over 300 submissions. An independent jury of global leaders in the field reviewed and scored the submissions and invited select authors to present their work in the poster hall. You can see the 82 posters and engage directly with the authors by entering the poster hall from the main timeline. You enter it from the main timeline. Okay. So if you are curious to know more about the conference partners and presenters in the resource gallery and other exhibition halls, it's located on the right-hand side of the platform. Conference partners and presenters in the resource gallery and other exhibition halls located on the right-hand side of the platform. The last thing, you can engage with each other and the presenters, and I'm sure that will be exciting, engaging with each other and the presenters. So we are here about flourishing, global flourishing, and connectedness. We encourage you to use the chat function in each plenary session to ask questions. You can also network with fellow attendees in the networking hub. Now let's begin the programming. Welcome everyone to the 2023 Global Flourishing Conference to advance science and solutions for a flourishing world.
Human flourishing starts with living your life in service of something bigger, and in doing so, making other people's lives better.
We as humans are so susceptible to awe. Sometimes it's to our detriment, sometimes it's to our advantage. The invisible things are extremely awe-inspiring and mentally and emotionally impactful.
So indigenous worldviews agree that human flourishing originates from a healthy environment That is, there's no human flourishing without planetary flourishing.
The science of human flourishing focuses on strengthening our innate capacities and scaffolding of human potential. And to me, this is science at its best. Rigorous conceptual thinking combined with data, experimentation, and innovations.
The only question we have left is, what are we waiting for?
Dear colleagues and friends, welcome to the Global Flourishing Conference. I'm Andrew Sarrazin, president of the Templeton World Charity Foundation. Over the next 2 days, we will convene some of the world's experts in research, innovation, and policy relating to how we can flourish, not just survive. We will discuss topics including the science of loneliness, love as the basis for public policy, how artificial intelligence can be used to make us more human, concepts of planetary flourishing, religious participation and social capital, polarization and pluralism, amongst many other topics. In between these dialogues, we will have spotlight talks that feature up-and-coming researchers, and we are profiling leading organizations that are putting this research into practice as part of a series on flourishing in action. These panels and spotlights serve to tell a full story of how different persons and organizations can come together as a community. In addition, I'm very pleased to welcome our sister organizations, the John Templeton Foundation and the Templeton Religion Trust, both of whom are represented on panels, as well as the Fetzer Institute, the Ford Foundation, the New Pluralists, and Time Magazine. I'm so excited by the momentum we've seen since the first Global Flourishing Conference a year ago, which marked our founder, Sir John Templeton's 110th birthday. But today, I'd like to begin my remarks by sharing a personal story. 22 years ago, as a research student, I spent a month in Burkina Faso, West Africa. I was traveling across a 500-mile transect in the hot, dusty, red earth of the Sahel. There are no natural resources to speak of in this region. Most people there live on less than $2 a day. There's a minimal cash economy and a changing and harsh environment. Yet in some villages, you could sense a palpable and durable happiness, and in others, isolation, a poverty of spirit and of fear. These observations in Burkina Faso first gave me a clue how strong social relationships and other invisible interior qualities may influence the health and well-being of people, as much or more than access to technologies or government services. I was there in Burkina Faso working on a project to understand the genetics of malaria-carrying mosquitoes, which culminated in the Mosquito Genome Project and published as a first author in Science magazine. About the same time, the United Nations Millennium Development Goals gave a fresh focus to international policy, and a few philanthropists, notably Bill and Melinda Gates, and leading researchers led to the formation of a new field called global health. That field was born out of tropical medicine, development studies, molecular biology, statistics, and public health. And this field connected researchers, innovators, policymakers, industry, and advocates under one umbrella. In the last 20 years, we've seen tremendous progress in all manner of global health outcomes. New technology, along with billions of dollars of funding, dozens of organizations, new laws, and most of all, lives improved. For example, we now have not one, but 2 malaria vaccines recommended by the World Health Organization. Today, I believe we have a similar unfrozen moment to build a field whose goals are not the reduction of certain human diseases, as it was for global health, but rather the promotion of human flourishing. Put simply, just as global health was important to progress at the turn of the 20th century, global flourishing is the field that we need right now. We need it because of the nature of the challenges we face. We need to transform energy usage to prevent the next pandemic, to cooperate on a truly planetary scale, to live peacefully together, and to nurture our humanity through AI. And progress, I believe, will not come from technical wizardry or legal dictates alone. Solutions, I believe, will come at the interface between scientific insight and a deeper wisdom about what it means to be human. A wisdom that comes from culture and from literature, art, philosophy, and importantly, faith. Let's take the effulgence recently of artificial intelligence systems sweeping the world. AI has been sold to us as the next great labor-saving device, the next word processor, washing machine, and cotton gin, and perhaps all of these things rolled into one. Use them, and we are told you will increase your productivity, reduce drudgery, hack your workflow. But what if these new technologies were optimized for virtue instead of for efficiency? What if they were developed to nurture hospitality and curiosity, gratitude, wonder, and self-control, instead of being developed as greedy vampires for human attention? I think the future would feel very different indeed. And it is my contention that the field of human flourishing can help us navigate this future. But we need to build this field from the ground up. This field encompasses a community working together to develop a common body of knowledge, develop and advance a set of common practices against a set of common goals. Common knowledge, common practices, common goals. And this is the purpose of the Global Flourishing Conference. We might think of flourishing as having 3 major and interconnected dimensions. First is a material dimension: physical health, mental health, physical security, and financial stability. The second is a relational dimension: relationship with the self, with loved ones, our family, our friends, and our society. And third, and importantly, there's a transcendent dimension to flourishing. And it is marked by an experience of being part of something that is greater than oneself. It is accompanied by feelings of awe and wonder, or the sense of the sacred. And we may have different specific interests in some of these areas, but I know what unifies us here today is our belief that all of these dimensions are important. And in fact, I think it is vital to resist reducing human flourishing to just a set of criteria or factors, because these dimensions connect in truly amazing ways. A few years ago, we ran a global call for ideas, which revealed a set of grand challenges for human flourishing. One of the first challenges we noticed was a need for better conceptual models for flourishing that account for a range of human experience. Most research has been conducted in a limited cultural and geographic zone, that of Western English-speaking, higher income countries. And this leaves out the majority of people in the world and must be corrected. So I invite you to tour the Digital Abstract Hall, where you can find posters from across the world from scientists who are defining and measuring flourishing in their own contexts. The diversity of scientists represented remains far too limited, but it is still an important and exciting preview of what could come with further investment. Another challenge is that we need better methods to collect data on different dimensions of human flourishing, which means data in real time, scalable to thousands of individuals, not reliant on self-reporting, and correlated to other behaviors or outcomes of importance. We also need new innovations that demonstrate how science can be used to impact the lives of people. Earlier this year, an international consortium of researchers led by Everett Worthington and Tyler Vanderveel released the results of a 5-country randomized control trial of a 2-hour forgiveness workbook. This study involved nearly 5,000 participants and showed that the workbook had substantial effects on helping people learn to forgive, and by doing so, helped alleviate symptoms of anxiety and depression. You can access this tool for free at discoverforgiveness.org. A final challenge that we noticed is that we need leaders to step up. The members of our conference program advisory committee are great examples of commitment. Folks like Matt Lee from Baylor and Harvard University, who have formed a practitioner community called the Flourishing Network, or Emiliana Simon Thomas of Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center. Each of our 13 program advisory committee members contributed countless hours in helping us plan these 2 days. A special note of gratitude goes to Bob Evans, who expertly and wisely chaired this committee. And so I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us. I hope you will stay for this entire conference. Make sure to check the schedule to find the most up-to-date information. We encourage you to enter comments and questions in the chat, and we'll feed those questions to session moderators. If you join for nothing else, log back in again Thursday at this time, where we'll have some very, very distinguished surprise guests that we'll be showcasing in the opening session. Sir John Templeton, the founder of the Templeton Philanthropies, was a relentless optimist who thought that humanity was in its infancy and on its way to ever greater possibilities. He called this era the blossoming time in human history. And he felt that difficult periods of change and challenge are actually ripe opportunities. As an investor, he often said that it was the point of maximum pessimism that was the best time to invest. And so now is the time for action. We have more than 3,500 people participating in this 2-day conference. And I think that forms a critical mass of engaged individuals who are committed to making a difference. Lastly, today is actually an important milestone in my own career. After an amazing 8 years as the first president of Templeton World Charity Foundation, I'll be transitioning from my role on December 1st. But fear not, Sir John intended the work of his foundations to take decades, if not centuries. And I look forward to the ways in which my longtime colleague, Tina Cambridge, will guide the organization and this community as the interim president of the Templeton World Charity Foundation. So please join me now in welcoming our first panel. That panel is entitled Science and Solutions for a Global World. In this panel, we hope to explore how the field might reframe or reimagine traditional concepts of health, well-being, and human happiness. And I'm so excited to be joined by 3 distinguished panelists. We have Dr. Tim Lomas, a research scientist at Harvard University's Program on Human Flourishing, Dr. Mitu Khosla, professor at Daulat Ram College at the University of Delhi, and Nancy Hay, executive director of the What Works Center for Wellbeing in London. So thank you all for joining me. In my intro, I gave a little summary of sort of my interpretation of the various dimensions of flourishing, that is the kind of material, the relational, and the transcendent. And so, Tim, I wanted to start with you. This year, you've published a book on happiness, and over the years, a number of papers about the different, understandings of happiness and well-being, including a recent paper on the 16 different forms of mental well-being. So I'm going to kick off with you here. How do you, it's a 2-part question, how do you define flourishing? And when you look at the long sweep of discourse around flourishing, how has that definition changed over time?
Thanks, Andrew, and wonderful to be here and to see everyone. It's a real honor to be on this panel. So in terms of our definitions of flourishing, I've been working closely with the director of the Human Flourishing Program, Tyler Vanderweel, to really try and refine and finesse what we mean by flourishing in related terms, because we have flourishing and well-being and happiness, and sometimes they're used somewhat synonymously, but trying to carve out distinct roles for each of them. So I can get into some of the more precise definitions in a second, but really the big picture for us is that flourishing is the grand scope of everything. It's the more all-encompassing term. So to put that into context, we would believe that, you know, a human being, really any sentient being, could experience health and well-being almost regardless of their circumstances, sometimes even in spite of them. I mean, humans are remarkably resilient. So, you know, even in great adversity or, you know, times of warfare, great material deprivation, people can attain levels of health and well-being, but we would argue that they're not truly flourishing unless those around them are doing well, the context in which they're in are doing well, the environment is doing well. So for us, flourishing is this bigger picture. It's the person themselves, but also their context, the broader situations in which they live, also being in a kind of in a good state. So you couldn't really be flourishing if, like I say, people around you are suffering, if the environment was really in great peril. So it draws out, it widens the aperture, it widens the lens, it draws our attention to the bigger issues. Not to lose sight of the person. It's not looking at systems and context instead of the person, but really the person in context. So it's trying to broaden our horizons in terms of how we conceptualize how people are doing. You know, it feels like positive psychology is sometimes critiqued as being individualistic, focusing on the person at the expense of looking at other people or the wider context. So that's the essence. Flourishing is this bigger picture. But then within that, there's lots of nuances. I don't know how long you want me to speak for. I could go down many rabbit holes here. But essentially, we align with what you were speaking of in terms of different dimensions of existence. So within this broader context, we look at health and well-being in relation to these different dimensions. So there's physical health and well-being, which aligns with what you were saying, mental health and well-being, social health and well-being, and then also spiritual health and well-being. So there we've been drawing on the kind of main WHO dimensions of health and well-being, and also adding the importance of the spiritual dimension there. But then we can get increasingly granular, so we can speak of mental health and well-being, and then for us, we use happiness for that dimension when we're speaking about mental health and well-being specifically. But then we can zoom in and then, like I say, carve it up with increasing granularity. There's maybe 16 forms, there's probably more. This is our attempt to take what was existing in the literature, you know, the common definitions I think many people be familiar with, subjective well-being, eudaimonic well-being, but then also reflect the fact, and I'm sure we'll speak about this during the session, the fact our current models of well-being perhaps have been shaped in a Western-centric context, and we're missing insights and ideas from other cultures. So this was part of our attempt to bring in some of these ideas and then expand our kind of taxonomy and conceptions of happiness. So I hope that's a decent.
Thank you, Tim. That's a great segue. I'll be coming back to you later just to sort of draw some of those distinctions out. But maybe I'll turn to Mitu now. You know, you've done extensive work in multicultural understanding of well-being and flourishing, particularly in your context, outside of a Western context. How might you sort of respond to what Tim had said, and what in your work might add to this perspective on flourishing?
First of all, thank you for inviting me here, and it's truly an honor to be participating in this conference. Yes, my work in the tribal communities, particularly in the northeast of India, and the indigenous communities in the Aboriginal communities in Canada, what we have found was that the prime notion for flourishing was values and compassion. So everything was revolving around these two important concepts. They particularly felt, what I have also learned is that while flourishing is not just one concept, it's something which is a process, and one has to dynamically work towards it. And you have to experience a lot of things when you're in the flow of achieving it. And they give a lot of importance to family well-being and also welfare for the community. These are two important things which came up in both these community people. And they said communities regenerate over time. And it's important to build cohesiveness. And what is important for this cohesiveness is the mutual respect, compassion, and unconditional support, which is very important component to put everything together in a one. They also talked about the socio-cultural traditions, which are very important, having a deep sense of gratitude, and this could be followed through rituals. So they were very, very concerned about preserving their rituals and their cultural identities. Forgiveness of self was equally important as forgiveness of others, and this was very important. Another important aspect which we observed was the bonding with the nature, that we are a part of the nature and we contribute to the nature. We are not different entities. So if we nurture the nature, we take care of it, it takes care of us. So this congruence is very important in order to feel flourishing. So facilitating interpersonal communication, nurturing meaningful relationships, love, pursuing self-reliance, but at the same time trying to make all efforts to preserve their own cultural values and traditions. So there was a very honest shift from self to those in the community and the environment, and how everybody could work in synchrony to one another. So this was the basic thing.
I love that. And I forgot to mention, me too, it is your birthday today as well. So happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. You share your birthday with Sir John Templeton, which, you know, is
Oh, really?
good company to keep. I'm
Okay.
reminded what you say about a definition of compassion, which is when love meets suffering.
Yes.
And later there'll be a panel on love as actually a basis for public policy. So thank you, Tim, and thank you, Mitu, for kind of laying out. I love the focus on the sort of relational aspects, the concepts like forgiveness and gratitude and compassion. I'm going to turn to Nancy now, and so the What Works Center for Wellbeing is actually a super important bridge between research and policy. Tim laid out a pretty expansive vision. I want to get back to sort of how we draw some boundaries, but I think this is an important question for you. We, in trying to do something in the world, take action, you have to choose where to focus. And so, can you give us some examples from your work about how research on these different dimensions of human flourishing can make, and maybe it already has been making a difference in the real world?
I think it's making a difference in the real world now, and I think there's huge progress. I think I'm probably very guilty of smushing all of this like major detail of research into like 140 characters. But that's where we need to differentiate between the detailed science and then how do we use it in practice. But there's some fantastic ones. So the What Works Centre for Wellbeing's job, we're a collaborating centre trying to understand what government, business, and civil society can do to improve wellbeing. So the focus is on action. It's also on collecting that collective learning. So really understanding what everyone can do and the contribution everybody makes in all of those areas to improving people's lives. So there's a couple of definitions that I use that I think are really helpful. And they're not my definitions, they're definitions that come from the literature that we've synthesized and tested with policymaking. And there are three. So national well-being is how we're doing as individuals, communities, and as a nation, and how sustainable that is for the future. We publish that data on all 10 dimensions of well-being for the whole of the UK every quarter alongside GDP. So that data is rich and it's growing, and it's been here for over 10 years, and it's a massive, massive data set. So we're working out how you can use that to improve lives. And when I'm talking about improving lives, community well-being is how we are doing together as a group of people, either geographically or a population in different ways. And individual well-being is, are we feeling good and are we functioning well? And that just works brilliantly as a really simple way to communicate and translate between these different areas. But there are a number of areas I want to just highlight. So material well-being, we have integrated the use of well-being evidence into policy and practice in the Treasury guidance on well-being, and using it in policy and appraisal and policy making. And in particular, we have a mission in the UK, a part of our levelling up work, which is an economic policy, which is how can everybody in the UK live happy and fulfilling lives? And that's really exciting as a goal, and it's shifting the dial. And it will help generate evidence for the next 10 years. We have a minister for loneliness. We have a loneliness strategy that over the last 5 years has gone from really not really knowing what improves social connection and loneliness to 5 years later, having made huge progress across all ages and really starting to understand what makes the difference about people's lives, and actually harnessing all of that activity. And on purpose, we have, on that bigger sort of transcendental bit, we've got a measure of purpose in the UK. Do we feel like what we do in life is worthwhile? And we've conducted the first ever analysis of it. And it's super exciting because it's population level data with big, big numbers of people. And things like faith, things like family, things like volunteering that GDP does not count come out in that analysis. And we can see it used in practice in things like a homelessness intervention, where they measure as success whether people feel like they now have something that in life is worthwhile. So this is really practical. We can take it really seriously, and we can really improve lives as a result of it.
Thanks, Nancy. I was looking at some of that data. The measures for the sort of worthwhile metric have been fairly stable.
Yeah.
You know,
And you'd expect them to be, because particularly during the pandemic, for example, we focused only on the things that really, really mattered, because that was really what was important, and that sustains it. But our problem is if you focus only on the things that you have to do rather than the things that you want to do, you don't have the positive emotion in the same way. And so what we saw is a massive bounce back, a decline in affect, in happiness, in positive emotion. And we only measure happiness at a national level, but that's not because the other emotions don't matter. It's because it's the singlest measure to collect positive affect. And so we do need this deeper research on all of these measures to help us understand those. These are just headline indicators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the pieces of interesting data that I've seen recently has to do with sort of a positive feeling towards the out group. So this would be affective polarization, measures, and so sort of how do you feel about somebody who's not like you? And actually, in many Western countries, the dramatic rise of negative affect, sort of partisan animosity or animosity in general to those out groups. So these factors do change, and I think interventions, as you're saying, can really make a difference. Tim, I wanted to pull back to you here just to go, help us narrow in a bit more about kind of coming to consensus on definitions. And I in my opening remarks talked about the need to have common knowledge, common set of theory, that drives common goals and common practices. But I mean, how do you see your work in kind of trying to come to draw some boundaries so that a community can evolve or come to some kind of sense of identity?
That's a good question, Andrew. And it's quite a tricky task, really, because throughout the literature, terms are used in so many different ways. And then people can be speaking about the same thing in different ways, or different things in the same way, and it becomes quite confusing. So we figured the best we could do was to, articulate a set of explicit definitions that worked for us and that were internally consistent, and then just to be transparent, and then just to say, here's how we're using these terms. If other people use them in a different way, then that's fine, but here's what we mean, and there's ways of translating what we're doing in terms of what they're doing. So, I mean, for example, I was quite drawn towards using a set of common terms and concepts that would then provide the basis for all these different foundations. So just very briefly, health and well-being, we define these as a personal state of quality. So we use personal because flourishing is personal and systemic. So that narrows it to the living being. A state means it's not necessarily enduring, but can last for varying amounts of time. And I love the notion of quality, just as something being kind of irreducibly and fundamentally good in some way. And then we can take these terms and play with them in various ways. So not to get too in the weeds, but we would think that health is more about the ontologically objective aspects of the person, so their material being, whereas well-being is about the ontologically subjective aspects, so their kind of conscious subjective experience. So her well-being might be a personal subjective state of quality, and health would be a personal objective state of quality. And then I mentioned we have these various dimensions of existence, so physical, mental, social, and spiritual. So mental would be a personal subjective mental state of quality. You can see how I'm going. You can play with the terms in different ways. And then flourishing, as I said, is the more expansive picture, where it's a personal and systemic state of quality involving all the conditions of one's life. So it's an attempt to bring all these terms together in a common framework that at least we're trying to be transparent and explicit, that people can then take it and hopefully find it useful and provide a kind of common language across different disciplines. I will say it's been an intriguing journey, because we're still, I think, probably working through some of these ideas ourselves. And what does it mean to say a person can flourish, but what else can flourish? What other phenomena, terms can that apply to? I would say it can apply to the environment. So to other living systems, can it apply to non-living systems, like an economy can flourish? That's a good use of it too. So I think we're still trying to work out the boundaries of how the terms apply, but I think we're getting towards, I think, a usable set of definitions, and it's been, yeah. Well, hopefully.
And you just mentioned a plug for two. Sorry to cut across. The two other panels that are happening. One on economics, the economics and human flourishing, which Adam Smith and sort of the founders of economics really thought about kind of human values and trade in the same way, and actually trade driving positive human values and vice versa. And then also sessions on planetary flourishing, where it's probably the most expansive kind of thing that we can think of, where you're trying to kind of locate the person in the context of planet. I wondered if you could maybe double click a little bit more on the concept of spiritual well-being. That might be something that's not too well known, from those listening today. So how would you kind of define that, put your arms around measuring that, given part of the challenge is that the transcendent is just that, right? It's ineffable and mysterious. So maybe you could just sort of provide some parameters for that measure.
Certainly, I'll have a go, and I'll do this by way of just quickly referencing something you just said. And you mentioned planetary well-being. Something I do want to get across is that it's sometimes easy to get lost in kind of dry, abstract definitions, and we found it quite helpful to think in metaphor. And we're really drawn to the kind of the botanical or the organic metaphor in terms of a person being, let's say, a plant or a tree in a garden. And the garden, you can expand that as much as you would like. It's one's immediate surroundings. It's obviously the environment more generally. But then I suppose to touch upon the spiritual question, it's this wider existence in which we find ourselves. And I think you mentioned in your introduction about being part of something that's wider or greater or deeper or more expansive than ourselves. And I think that gets to the heart of the matter, because we have speaking personally, I would say we have a certain conception of ourselves as a limited being existing in time and space. And I think we have these blinkers on that perhaps shields us to a greater reality, of which we have glimpses, but it's hard to really wrap our heads around. But it's something that we are more than who we think we are. And, we give words to aspects of this realization, like spirit and soul. And I think that's getting to something that whatever ideas I have about myself as a person, as a human being, Tim, this doesn't really capture the essence of what this being here is doing on this earth. And I think we have glimpses of that, and we give that names like the sacred and the transcendent, and there's a deeper reality we're part of, and then within that deeper reality, other types of beings, which we would also give labels to. And I think we struggle to access and understand them, but I think we get glimpses that are very real and very meaningful to people. So I would say, in terms of the spiritual well-being, it's something to do with the recognition of this wider reality, but something also to do with a sense of moving towards it, expanding outwards into it in some sense. So it's tricky territory, and in terms of measuring, that's perhaps a whole other issue. And we can fix words to these experiences and ask people to the extent to which they've had those experiences, and we can go somewhere along those lines. But I think ultimately language does struggle to capture this more magnificent vision we perhaps hopefully are a part of.
Well, unfortunately, we're not limited to English. So me too. I know you've done a lot of work with communities, indigenous communities, tribal peoples, but also in your context in Delhi, the rich language that your context provides for the spiritual, and so I think you've also written about the kind of the deeper meanings there, so I was wondering if you could comment on this aspect of spiritual well-being or flourishing from that perspective.
Well, most of the work which we have done has focusing on the level of spirituality and higher level of consciousness with transcendence. So I have used a lot of intervention programs where I have introduced yoga and meditation along with compassion, because particularly during the pandemic, there was a great need for that among the students also and in the local community also. So we developed this program on building resilience through compassion and yoga, and we were very successful in enhancing not only their cognitive well-being but also their affective well-being. And this also helped in reducing the level of stress they were experiencing, the trauma they were experiencing, because many lives were lost and there were a lot of problems people were facing. We also developed a program on SCAN, which is Sharing, Caring, and Nurturing program, which focuses on how you can create bonds within the community members and the environment so that we work for the common good. Now, this is sharing a feeling of happiness, sharing and trying to share even food. A simple thing like having an opportunity to cook the food together, to share it on the same table and to have a conversation that leads not only to catharsis but also to a lot of psychosocial support. So small things like celebrating festivals even when there's a crisis time. So what we observed was that if you're caring with one another and you are being party to somebody else's festivities, you're not only giving but you're also taking in turn. So this program was very successful, and we tried to take these along with the nurturing program, where you can use resources from the environment to nurture yourself. And especially during the meditation techniques, we try to focus on the level of uh, you know, spiritual level, along which they could go to a higher level of thinking, where they could go beyond themselves, beyond me, myself, my identity, to a wider perspective, to observe something which is not visible but which can be experienced, and to use that for their thinking, to relax themselves, to be a better human being, and also to spread goodness in the community. That was very important. So this is something which we are still doing, and these programs are very successfully done. And through global community of practice, this is our main intention, is to involve more people. Like this elder which I recently met in Saskatchewan, I shared these thoughts with him, and he gave me a small medallion and a stone to show that how earth is so important. So I talked to him about the Flourishing program, if he would like to work with us. So he says anything that helps the community, the society, the environment, I'm all in for it. And similarly, in the tribal communities, also when we reach, even in the Lakshadweep Islands, when we reach to the Minicoy Islands, which are not very accessible to, they have lovely information. They're so knowledgeable people, but their voices are not heard in the modern society. You cannot get their voices because of the language barriers, the communication barriers. So our work, we try to go to their level, try to interact with them personally, get all that information, and try to make sure that how that knowledge can be shared with people in the larger community, and they have a larger voice because they have lots to contribute to us. So that is something which is totally from the heart, what they try to do and how they connect us with the nature, this human mind, body, and the psyche, how it connects with the universe. They give a lot of importance to the universal functioning, how universe is responsible for us, and that if we give ourselves completely to the universe, so our goodness is going to come back to us. So like he was just talking about it, negative emotions are also important, and how Nancy said, it's thus not the positive emotions. Yes, negative emotions are very important. In fact, we did a lot of facial expression studies also in these communities to try to observe their non-verbal expressions and see what exactly, how they are implying what is flourishing. So if you're just giving a smile, it's not just a smile from the heart, it's a fake smile. So what is it that is generating the truth from inside? Why and how flourishing can be created? So there's lots of work that has to be done. There's lots of support we need. We need to involve a lot of researchers from all over the globe, to work hands together to reach out to as many of these communities as possible, so that we can have something, because flourishing is not something that is limited to a few people or a few words, a few contexts. It is something more vast than this.
And I think you point, thank you for sharing that. You point to really, I think, to me, what is a frontier of research, which is that interpersonal or relational dimension where,
yes.
Self-report of an individual, the measures that we use are necessarily, individual and personal and subjective. So how do you capture something that's real, that's happening between people or between subjects? So the intersubjective, I think that's
I mean,
super.
we developed certain questionnaires on our pilot studies, but they didn't work. When you go in the community, your questionnaires don't work. The most important thing is that your originality, your intention has to be very clear, and that your genuinity has to come across, that you are there to learn, you're there to share, you're there to care. And only then, when this relationship is formed, then you can just delve into their cultural patterns, their traditions, their knowledge systems, and that's when things actually open up. But if we go there as a researcher with a form to collect data, we don't get anything. It's just yes and no's which are useless. So in order to get more qualitative information, we have to immerse into those societies. We have to be part of it. So like this elder actually gave me a name. He sang a song for me he took me to his log hut. We sat inside that, the sweat lodge, and then he sang a song and he says, okay, this is the name that has come for you, which is a woman who's caring and loving. So like that, a bond has been formed, so that the work goes on. So it is just not a one-time job, which is that this is something which has to go on, and this has to spread not to just one community, it has to go on to other communities. So this is the only way to reach out to other people. That's what I feel.
Well, thank you for that. And I think one other thing you mentioned that was really important was the connection between sort of the affect or the practice of yoga or compassion and other outcomes. And I think that's, to me, that's a really important connection here. So it's the dimension, it's the relationship between these different dimensions of flourishing, where evidence, evidence is really, really helpful, because, if you're more attuned to some kind of outcomes, you will pay attention to that. And I think that's maybe a good place to bring Nancy, you back in here on this. I'm sure you have some thoughts about this, but I think I had a question really about evidence. Like, what's the right kind of evidence in your experience? And maybe that's just a silly question or superficial question, but like, what's the right sort of kind of evidence when you're again speaking to researchers who are in the audience today? How can their work wind up in a report that you write and release, and sort of what's your thoughts on sort of quality there?
I think it's a really great question, actually, and Mitu's described some of the real challenges of doing this in practice, and that's informed quite a lot of the approaches we've chosen to use. So it takes sort of an average of 17 years to get from evidence to action, and we try and reduce that gap. And sometimes science is just the science, right? And it shouldn't necessarily shift into practice yet. And that's completely fine. That's why I often summarize a whole body of knowledge in one sentence, which can feel awful, but that's fine, because you've got 70% of the people who come to our site are completely new to the topic and just want to find out quite quickly. They don't really want to know the nuances of how we measure it, but they can then get further into it. One of the things that is important is understanding the context in which that evidence will be used, and vice versa. And so one of the things we do through the process of our evidence generation is bring evidence users and evidence generators together to understand the questions and limitations as they go through it. But it may not always look like how you envisaged it starting out either. So it may start off as awe and beauty, and it may end up in a planning regulation, right? And it may not necessarily look the same thing. And being open to that. And
I'm not sure I've ever seen awe and beauty in a planning regulation, but I'll take your word for it.
Town planners deal with this stuff. So again, this is thinking about what it means for the evidence in that context, whether you're a public health professional, whether you're an HR professional, whether you are in office development, all these different areas, about how you bring in these different things in that context. But sometimes we use both quantitative and qualitative evidence. And sometimes to answer the question, you need really great qual. And sometimes we need to get some numbers on this stuff. And so we do both types of synthesis. And we do evidence synthesis because that helps people get into the evidence really quickly to summarize a body of knowledge. But sometimes we need to go right back to the basics to understand what's going on here, rather than rushing to RCT, which is this tendency to go, I must have the best possible evidence. And sometimes we need to go right back. What are we talking about here? What are the concepts and indicators that we're using? What actually is the theory of change here? How do we expect it to work? How can we improve it? And move from there. So I think lots of different types of evidence have a role to play, but understanding what we already know collectively and then working together to fill those evidence gaps for practice as well as for just science purposes is really, really exciting. And there's ways to do that quite systematically to build a field.
And you spoke about the impact on loneliness. Do you have some examples of how that's been implemented in the UK for loneliness?
Yeah, so the story on loneliness is really quite nice. So in 2018, we had a commission on loneliness because one of our politicians, Jo Cox, died. Really sadly, she was murdered. And one thing she was doing was around loneliness. And there was a cross-party commission that we helped bring the evidence on social connection to. And as a result of that, there was a loneliness strategy. And we did a review of all the different types of things that you could do to improve loneliness, to tackle it. And we found nothing worked. And that was slightly worrying. And one of the reasons why we found that nothing worked is that we were comparing apples with pears. We were comparing social isolation with loneliness, with all these different types of things. And there was nothing for age under 55, right? No interventions at all. But it turns out people are lonely under age 55, and loneliness accumulates across the lifespan. So we had to go right back to basics in some areas. And then 5 years later, we've systematically worked with a whole range of practitioners and researchers to build that field, sometimes doing really foundational research about young people, for example, sometimes replicating and trialing to try and work out what's going on in other areas as well. So, and looking across all the cohort studies we've got in the UK as well to harmonize the metrics. So lots of different types of research can move forward. We now have things that work.
Such as?
Well, there's a whole range of different things.
Yeah.
Some of them are like joint social activities, and we can do them better to make them more effective in what they do. Psychological interventions really, really work. Interestingly, they're less used in practice, and that's quite an interesting gap. So that's an implementation gap. And those types of things get us really quite interested in the difference that we can make about trusted adults, supportive friends, reducing social isolation, and improving connectedness as well.
I've one last follow-up. What role does the pub play in reducing social isolation?
I love this one. This is such a British one. So for years I was working out how you could sort of measure this social capital impact of a pub, and this concern of like a social community hub that people can go to feel part of a community. It's sometimes called a third place, and there's lots of different types of ones, these cafes and stuff. But I think the pub is quite uniquely British, and I think when it's somewhere where you can go where everybody knows your name, I guess, where you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself, that you have a sense of belonging. But that sense of belonging became a policy focus, and that's why I was so keen that we also had so some things that improve belonging can reduce intergroup connection, so that having social connection between different groups, and pubs can do that as well. But yeah, there was funding for pubs in the recent budget announcements here in the UK for almost exactly that reason.
I did not know that. So we have a few minutes left, so I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions you want to see if we can get in before we have to move on, please send them now. I think I'm gonna, thank you, Nancy. I'm gonna, I think sort of end with like a question about gaps. So, what's in that sort of conceptual models, in methods, in innovations, in leaders, where do you see gaps in moving the field of human flourishing forward, and what do you think we collectively can do about those gaps? Anybody can jump in to answer that first while others think.
I've got some immediate thoughts and there's some asks. So in the UK, we've just started collecting data on hope nationally, and we'll do that quarterly. And so please use that data to help us understand hope better. I know that some colleagues have been doing conceptual and indicators work around that, and then starting to work out what we can do to improve it. But similarly on agency and other types of autonomy and other areas as well. So the recent OECD guidelines review on subjective wellbeing had some really exciting areas to explore, particularly around eudaimonic wellbeing, which I would really encourage, and particularly around getting some rigor and seriousness about this stuff. This matters. Let's take it seriously. Let's register the trials that we do, so that things that don't work also get found as well. And I'd like to see some work on conceptual work around family wellbeing as well. I think this is an area where we've often looked at family breakdown, but we don't often look at what helps keep families well. But then lastly, where's the leadership on this? There's no obvious department for this. There's no obvious foundation for this other than yourselves. And so I think leadership across society on this is something we need to cultivate and develop as well.
I agree.
Yes, the global community of practice is actually trying to work on this and develop leaders in different countries, so that they can represent and reach out to other people in the community. This is one of our aims we plan to do. And Professor Matthew
Me too.
Lee
What's the name of that global community of practice? Does it have a name?
This is Global Community of Practice, which was, if Matthew Lee is here, he would talk more about it.
Okay.
I'm just a part of it, and we're developing some collaborations with people all across the globe so that we could reach out to other levels in our community. So basically, we have certain programs where we need to understand how to reconnect these communities with one another, how to make their voices heard, how to go through their knowledge systems, and also, how to include them into the modern system of working. And very important here is also the point that we have to involve more research into this and publications, how to reach out to people. In my book, I try to give a lot of emphasis on indigenous healing practices, tribal healing practices, faith healing practices, so that people know about how they work. It's not something like a facade, but it is something which is very meaningful to our society. So we actually need to join hands together. We need to have more funding for this to reach out. I mean, I've reached out to about 12, 13 tribes in India, but this is all, we have no funding, but still the work goes on. So we need to have researchers with sheer determination and passion to pursue work, despite all barriers. We've had language barriers, which is also a very big issue. me not speaking that language, I'm not able to get the information, and the ability to have more creativity into collecting data, into understanding, and not just collecting data, but also to developing relationship with these people, trying to use their knowledge for the goodness of the society. That is what is important. And obviously, we have to pen this down, we have to write it, we have to publish it so that people see, read, become more aware of it, and more people join us. That is very important.
Thank you, me too. Tim, gaps.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, just to follow up on those really important points just now, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I think one of the main issues with our scholarship so far is it's tended to be Western centric. I mean, I want to be careful there because I don't want to imply that there hasn't been fantastic scholarship all over the world, but there's nevertheless been a kind of dominance by, I guess, scholarship as practiced in the West, and it's reflected in the fact that lots of our work is in English. And so, for example, I have a project on untranslatable words, which reflects the fact that, there's words and concepts in other languages that we don't have in English. And if they're not in English, then we're not tending to study them or look at them in our scholarship. So I would say there's a...
I won't ask you for an example because I wouldn't understand it anyway.
All right, no, fair enough. The thing is, I think this movement is already happening, and your organization is a reflection of that, which is beautiful. And I think so is the work we're doing at the Human Flourishing Program with the Global Flourishing Study. But I think there needs to be much more movement in that direction, just to take a global perspective, not just in terms of the people we study, but the people who are doing the studying, the ideas we use, the concepts we use. So much more global conversation. And then I would say, just finally, even looking further beyond that, I think even that global perspective can still be quite human-centric. And I think even further ahead, we need to bring in consideration of other forms of well-being in terms of non-human forms of life, whether that's organic life on Earth or AI systems, if and when they become conscious, other beings elsewhere in the galaxy, who knows? But I think expanding outwards beyond our own culture to take in all human beings, then even beyond human beings to take in other life forms for their own sake, but also for our own life and self-interest. We'll do well when other life forms are also thriving. And this touches back to the point about kind of environmental considerations and well-being. So hopefully that's where we might go in the future.
Thank you. That reminds me. So it reminds me of two programs at the Templeton World Charity Foundation. One called Diverse Intelligences, which is looking out across animal, non-animal, non-human animal perspectives on intelligence, including computational, as well as really understanding consciousness. These are foundational questions when it comes to the basis of subjective experience. So thank you today for an amazing discussion. We're just getting started. You can check out the Resource Center in the platform. Thank you, Nancy, me too, and Tim. Yeah. And I'm going to hand it over back to Reddy, who's going to introduce our next segment. So thank you very much. And you guys are amazing.
Thank
you.
What a great conference.
Thank you. You used the right word. You used the right word. It was an amazing, amazing delivery, amazing conversation to listen to. Thank you so much, Andrew, Tim, Nancy, and Mita for starting us off today. And again, happy birthday to you. And I hope the rest of your day is full of flourishing. So the field of human flourishing research and innovation looks very bright indeed. So